The morning mist clung to Sophie's hair, damp and heavy, as she crept toward the Dalton farm. Her stomach ached, empty and insistent, a reminder of the fragile life of her little brother waiting back home. The farm seemed impossibly vast, darkened by the shadows of barns and fences, and the stories she had heard filled her mind. Frank Dalton, a man with a reputation like iron, would punish anyone daring to step foot on his land. And yet, there was no turning back. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the tin can grow heavier in her hands with the weight of responsibility. The cows ahead lifted their heads, their eyes quiet but aware. One moved closer, curious, sniffing the air around her trembling fingers. The warmth of its body, the soft exhalations, seemed to whisper that she was not alone. That small, delicate moment, the brush of fur, the first tentative milk drop, was a spark, a heartbeat of courage that would ignite a chain of events no one could predict. It was a story about bravery, loyalty, and the extraordinary bond between a child and the animals who silently promised to stand by her. The shack leaned against the wind as if it had been fighting storms all its life and was finally too tired to stand straight. Its wooden boards, warped and weather-stained, left thin cracks that whistled with every gust of the cold Texas dawn. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth and smoke, long faded from a fire that had not been lit for weeks. There was no table, no furniture worth mentioning, only a thin blanket laid across the dirt floor where two children huddled, fighting a hunger that had been gnawing at them for days. Sophie Miller, 7 years old, sat upright against the wall, her knees pulled to her chest, her dark hair tangled around a face far too solemn for a child. In her lap lay Ethan, her 3-year-old brother, his cheeks hollow, his lips chapped, his small fists rubbing at his eyes as tears carved pale lines through the dust on his face. He whimpered again, that heartbreaking sound that was not quite a cry anymore, more like the surrender of a child, too tired to keep begging. "Hush, Ethan," Sophie whispered, rocking him gently. Her voice was soft, but carried the weight of someone who had been forced to learn too much too soon. She reached for the tin cup beside her, filled only with water she had drawn from a rusty pump half a mile away. It tasted of iron and mud, but she dipped her finger into it and touched Ethan's lips, as if pretending it was milk. "It'll help," she lied, though her own stomach twisted painfully at the thought. Beside them, on a piece of torn cloth, lay the remains of a stale loaf of bread given by a neighbor the week before. The crumbs had hardened into pebbles. Sophie broke one in half, softened it with a few drops of water, and pressed it into Ethan's mouth. He chewed without protest, his eyes fluttering half-closed, too weak even to resist. Sophie forced herself to smile at him, though her lips trembled. "See? Better, right? You're strong, Ethan, just like Papa used to say." The mention of their father brought an ache into her chest that no amount of will could stop. It had been only 6 months since the accident, the night a truck had skidded off the wet road and crushed the wagon that carried both her parents. In the span of one evening, Sophie and Ethan had gone from children with a family to orphans with nothing but each other. She remembered the funeral, the hurried whispers of neighbors, the pitiful looks, and how quickly people stopped coming around once the weeks stretched on. Now, survival was her burden. She had become mother, father, and sister all at once, though she was still small enough that her feet barely reached the floor when she sat on the lone wooden stool in the corner. A sudden cry from Ethan snapped her back to the present. His tiny hands pulled at her sleeve. "Hungry, Lena," he whimpered, using the nickname he had made up for her. His blue eyes, so wide and pleading, were rimmed with red. Sophie bit her lip until she tasted blood. She had no answer left. She smoothed his blonde hair with her palm, whispering again and again, "I know, I know." Through the slats in the wall, the early light of dawn spilled in, drawing golden lines across the dirt floor. Beyond that light lay the sight Sophie both hated and longed for, the Dalton dairy farm. Its fields stretched green and endless, dotted with cows grazing lazily, their coats glossy, their bellies full. Even at this hour, farm hands in clean overalls moved about briskly, preparing for another day's work. From where Sophie sat, she could hear the faint sound of buckets clanking, the low hum of tractors, and the contented moo of well-fed animals. The unfairness of it pressed down on her like a stone. On one side of the fence, prosperity, abundance, the smell of fresh hay and milk. On her side, rot, hunger, and despair. She hated herself for staring so long, but she could not look away. She remembered the whispers she had overheard in town. Frank Dalton, he'd sell the air if he could bottle it. Richest man in 3 counties, but meaner than a rattlesnake. His wife, Margaret, used to be kind, but he's broken that out of her. To Sophie, Frank Dalton's farm was not just a place of wealth. It was the line between life and death. She knew that behind those fences stood cows heavy with milk. Milk that could soothe Ethan's cries, fill his empty stomach, and maybe, just maybe, give him a chance to sleep without hunger twisting his little body. Ethan stirred again, coughing weakly. Sophie pulled him closer, rocking him as she stared at the faint outline of the fence in the distance. Her chest rose and fell quickly, as though she were already preparing for the decision she had been dreading. She lowered her gaze to the dented tin can sitting by her side. It had once been their mother's flour tin, now the only vessel she could use to carry milk. Her small fingers traced the jagged edge where it had rusted. She clenched it tightly in her hand, feeling its weight, as though it carried the weight of her choice. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. Fear whispered that if she was caught, Frank Dalton would not hesitate to punish her. But Ethan's frail breathing against her chest told her a greater truth. If she didn't try, her brother would not last. She bent her head close to Ethan's ear and whispered, her voice breaking, "I'll get you something. I promise. I'll find a way." The boy stirred, half asleep, murmuring, "Milk?" "Yes, milk," Sophie said, though the word felt like both hope and sin. The first light of dawn grew stronger, spilling across the land like a curtain lifting on a stage. Sophie pressed a kiss to Ethan's forehead, laid him gently on the blanket, and stood. The tin can trembled in her grip, but her eyes held a fire too strong for her small frame. The shack was silent except for the shallow breaths of the sleeping boy. Sophie stepped into the cold morning air, the smell of wet soil rising to greet her. Ahead, past the crooked fence and the dew-kissed grass, the Dalton farm glistened in the light. She tightened her grip on the can and whispered, almost like a prayer, "If I don't try, Ethan won't survive." And with that, Sophie set her bare feet on the path toward the farm, her shadow long and fragile against the rising sun. The fence stood like a scar across the land, thin wires strung between posts that glimmered with morning dew. On one side, life flourished in color and abundance. On the other, hunger clung to the shacks like a sickness that would not release its grip. Sophie had stared at that divide so many times that she had memorized every crooked post, every knot of barbed wire, as if the fence itself mocked her each day. The Dalton farm spread out in rolling fields of emerald. The grass seemed to sway with pride, kissed by the light of dawn, shimmering as though each blade had been brushed with silver. Cows dotted the pasture, their coats glossy, their bellies full, their movements slow and unhurried. They chewed cud lazily, tails swatting at flies, as if they belonged to another world entirely, one where hunger was a story told by strangers. Even their moos sounded content, deep and steady, echoing across the field like a hymn of comfort. Sophie pressed her small hands against the rough wooden slats of the fence, splinters biting into her skin. She did not notice. Her eyes stayed locked on the cows, especially the motherly ones with udders full, glistening in the light. She imagined the milk, warm, white, and sweet, filling Ethan's little tin cup, washing away his tears, softening his cries. The thought brought a lump to her throat so heavy she could hardly swallow. Behind her, the shantytown stretched in pitiful contrast. Houses made of adobe, patched with rusted tin, leaned crookedly on themselves. Thin smoke rose from fires, fed with scraps of wood, and the smell was sharp, acrid, not the pleasant smell of hickory or oak, but of desperation, burnt rags, bits of trash, whatever the families could find. Children, not much older than Ethan, wandered barefoot in the dirt, their ribs pressing against thin shirts, their bellies round, not from fullness, but from hunger. Their eyes carried the same dull glaze Sophie had seen in her brother after days without food. The fence did not only mark land, it marked lives. She leaned her forehead against the wood, whispering to herself as if the fence might listen. Why them, and not us? She remembered voices she had overheard in the village when she went searching for bread one afternoon. The women at the well had spoken in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders before gossiping about the man whose fields could be seen for miles. Frank Dalton would sell the air if he thought he could bottle it. Richest man in 3 counties, and meaner than a rattlesnake. They say his wife used to smile, used to sing in church. But now, you never see her face. He's broken the kindness out of her. Sophie had pretended not to listen, busy tying her shoe with frayed laces, but each word carved itself into her memory. Even at 7, she knew the weight of cruelty when it fell into silence. Now, as she watched the white farmhouse sitting proud atop the rise, its windows gleaming in the light, she felt those whispers stir again in her mind. That house had more rooms than her whole neighborhood combined. Its roof did not leak when it rained, its walls did not bend with the wind, and within it lived a man who owned everything her brother needed to live, but who would sooner let milk sour in the sun than spare a drop for a child. Her fists clenched tighter on the fence. She imagined standing before Frank Dalton himself and shouting what burned in her chest. Ethan is only 3. He is not a thief. He is just hungry. But Sophie's voice was small, and her courage even smaller when she remembered the stories of men thrown off Dalton's land for trespassing. Her gaze shifted back to the cows. One of them, a large brown and white with calm eyes, lifted its head and looked directly at her. For a moment, Sophie felt seen, not as a thief, not as a beggar, but simply as a child longing for something pure. The cow's jaw moved in a slow rhythm, chewing calmly, and Sophie almost imagined it understood. "Do you know?" she whispered softly. "Do you know my brother cries for you every night?" The animal blinked, then lowered its head to graze again, but something in Sophie's heart clung to that silent exchange. Behind her, Ethan stirred on the blanket where he lay curled in the shack's shadow. Even asleep, he whimpered, his lips forming the word milk, though no sound followed. Sophie turned back quickly, guilt pressing down on her chest for staring too long at what she could not have. She crouched beside him, smoothing his hair, listening to the faint wheeze in his breathing. She could no longer separate the image of her brother from the sight of those full pastures. The fence was only wood and wire, but it felt like the wall between life and death. On one side, Ethan's hunger would never end. On the other, hope shimmered with the dew. The neighbors whispered warnings about Dalton's greed, about how stepping on his land was like stepping into a trap. But hunger had no patience for warnings. It howled louder than fear, louder than sense. Sophie pressed her hand against Ethan's bony shoulder and whispered, "I'll fix it. I'll find a way." A gust of wind rattled the fence. She lifted her face toward the sunrise, its warmth brushing her cheeks. The day was beginning, and so was her decision. She picked up the dented tin can lying near the door of the shack, holding it against her chest. The metal was cold, but in her hands it became something more, a vessel of promise, of risk, of love so desperate it was willing to gamble everything. Her eyes flicked once more to the farm, to the glossy cows grazing in plenty. She imagined them walking across the fence line, crossing into her side of the world, carrying salvation with every step. But they never did. They belonged to Frank Dalton, just like the land, just like the wealth, just like every drop of milk her brother needed. Her throat tightened. Her heart thudded hard enough that she pressed her hand to her chest to steady it. Tomorrow, at dawn, she would cross the fence. She knew the risk. She knew the cruelty of the man who ruled those fields, but she also knew the truth that burned brighter than fear. Ethan could not wait any longer. She whispered again, to herself, to the wind, maybe even to the cows who grazed in the distance. "I'll do it for you, Ethan, no matter what happens." And as the first sunbeam spread wide across the Dalton farm, Sophie felt her resolve harden. Hunger had forced her hand, and love for her brother would carry her across that fence, into the unknown. The night settled heavy over the shack, wrapping the world in a silence, broken only by the restless stirrings of a hungry child. Sophie lay awake on the hard floor, her arms curled protectively around Ethan. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by soft whimpers as he shifted, chasing dreams that never brought him comfort. Each sound pierced Sophie's chest like a needle. The roof above them groaned with the wind, rattling loose boards. Through the cracks, moonlight spilled faintly across the room, silvering the outline of the dented tin can resting near Sophie's feet. It gleamed like a promise and a threat. She stared at it for so long her eyes burned. Her stomach growled, a hollow, twisting pain that had long since become part of her body. But what made her chest ache more was the weight of Ethan's small frame against her. She could feel his bones through the thin cloth of his shirt. He was too light, too fragile, and she knew children his age weren't meant to be this weak. Sophie closed her eyes and whispered to the dark, "Tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow." The words slipped out like a vow, binding her more tightly than anything spoken in church. Sleep came only in fragments. She drifted into memories of her parents, of a time when hunger wasn't the only thing she knew. She saw her father, tall and gentle, lifting her onto his shoulders during the county fair, his laughter booming as he bought her a candied apple. She remembered her mother's soft hands kneading dough, the smell of warm bread filling their home. Those memories were sharp now, cutting into her with both sweetness and grief. Then came the memory she could never shake. The screech of tires, the shattering of glass, the screams swallowed by the night. She had clutched Ethan, only a baby then, as neighbors pulled them away from the wreckage. In a single night, her parents were gone, and Sophie was left with a responsibility too big for her tiny shoulders. A shiver coursed through her body, dragging her back into the present. She opened her eyes to the shack's emptiness and felt the weight of tomorrow pressing down. Hours crept by. When the first pale streaks of dawn slid across the horizon, Sophie was already sitting upright, clutching the tin can in her lap. Her fingers trembled as she traced its dented edges, rust biting at her skin. It was small, pitiful even, but to her it felt like a lifeline. She looked down at Ethan. His lips were parted slightly, his breath uneven, his cheeks sunken. He had cried himself to sleep the night before, mumbling her name until exhaustion silenced him. Sophie brushed a strand of blonde hair from his forehead. "Stay here, Ethan," she whispered. "I'll bring you something this time. I promise." The promise hung in the air, fragile but unbreakable. She rose quietly, careful not to wake him. The dirt floor was cold beneath her bare feet. Pulling the tin can against her chest, she stepped outside into the chill of morning. The world was hushed, the kind of silence that came just before the land fully woke. The sky bled slowly from black to gray, streaked with the faintest blush of pink at the horizon. Dew clung to the grass, shimmering like diamonds she could never touch. The air smelled of wet earth and distant hay, clean and sharp. From where she stood, Sophie could see the Dalton farm sprawling across the distance. The fence glistened with moisture, its barbs catching the light like cruel teeth. Beyond it, the cows moved slowly in the fields, their massive bodies outlined in mist. A few lifted their heads as though sensing her presence, their breath steaming in the cold. Sophie's knees quivered, but she took a step forward. The tin can shook in her hands, rattling softly, betraying her fear. She clutched it tighter, pressing it against her chest as if it could steady her heart. Her mind filled with warnings. Frank Dalton's wrath, the stories of trespassers driven out, the memory of neighbors whispering about his cruelty. But then another image rose stronger. Ethan's face, streaked with tears, whispering her name in hunger. The fear did not vanish. It never could. But it was drowned out by something deeper, fiercer. Love. Sophie stopped at the edge of the field, staring at the fence. She inhaled deeply, the breath shuddering in her chest, and whispered the words that had burned inside her all night. "If I don't try, Ethan won't survive." Her voice cracked, but the truth of it settled like iron in her bones. She bent down, tested the wires with her small fingers. The barbs pricked her skin, drawing thin lines of red. She winced, but she did not pull back. She would bleed if she had to. She would crawl. She would run. She would risk everything. The world on the other side of the fence was not just a farm. It was life itself, waiting to be stolen one drop at a time. Sophie pressed the tin can against her lips for a moment, almost like a prayer. Then she slipped through the shadows of the dawn, her little body bending, trembling, but resolute. The first step was the hardest. The second came easier. By the third, her fear had transformed into something sharper, a kind of desperate courage. The Dalton farm loomed closer, and with it, the possibility of saving her brother. Sophie kept walking, bare feet wet with dew, heart pounding with both terror and hope. The plan was reckless, fragile as a breath, but it was all she had, and she would see it through. The world still belonged to shadows when Sophie stepped into the field. Dawn was only just lifting its pale hand across the horizon, tinting the sky in soft strokes of gray and rose. The grass was wet with dew, cold against her ankles. and each step left her skin trembling with a chill that seemed to sink straight into her bones. She carried the dented tin can close to her chest, the metal damp and slick from her sweaty palms. Ahead, the fence loomed. To anyone else, it was a simple barrier of wood and wire, but to Sophie it felt like a wall of judgment, daring her to test it. The barbs caught the faint light, sharp as teeth, warning her of pain, of punishment, of the dangers that lay beyond. She paused only a few feet away, heart hammering so loudly she feared it might wake the whole farm. Her breath came shallow, quick, clouding in the cold air. She could hear the distant lowing of cows across the field, calm and steady, but in her ears it sounded like an alarm. Every bird that rustled in the hedges made her flinch. Even the creak of her own joints as she crouched felt deafening. Her mind whispered warnings. If they catch you, he will beat you. He will throw you out, maybe worse. But the hunger in her brother's thin frame rose stronger, drowning out the voice of fear. She closed her eyes for a moment and saw Ethan's face as it had been the night before, tear-streaked, lips murmuring milk. "I have to," she whispered, barely moving her lips. "For Ethan." She reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the first strand of wire. It was damp with dew, cold and unforgiving. She winced as one of the barbs pricked her finger, a small sting followed by the bead of warm blood. She pressed the cut against her dress, then lowered herself to her knees. The soil was hard, cold, and littered with stones that dug into her skin. She lowered herself further, pressing her cheek to the wet ground as she began to crawl beneath the lowest strand. The tin can rattled softly against her chest, and she froze. Terrified, the sound had traveled. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her ears strained to catch any sign of footsteps, any bark of a dog, any shout from a farmhand. Nothing came. Only the steady chorus of morning, the sigh of the wind, the hum of crickets, the distant coo of a mourning dove. Sophie exhaled slowly, then pushed herself forward. The barbed wire snagged at her hair, tugging painfully as strands caught and tore away. She bit her lip, forcing herself not to cry out. Her small shoulders squeezed beneath the lowest strand, and for a moment she thought she wouldn't fit. The fence pressed into her back. The earth scraped her stomach, and she felt trapped in between, neither free nor safe. Her breath came faster, panic threatening to overwhelm her. She shut her eyes, whispering in her mind, "Don't stop, Sophie. Don't stop now." With a final wriggle, she pushed herself through, the barbs tearing at the fabric of her dress, leaving thin scratches across her skin. She tumbled onto the other side, grass wet against her face, her chest heaving. For a moment, she just lay there, cheek pressed into the earth, the tin can clutched tight against her ribs. Her whole body trembled from fear and exertion. She listened. Oh, how she listened, for any sound that might mean discovery. But the world remained still. The Dalton fields stretched before her, vast and green, glowing softly in the newborn light. Mist curled low across the grass, wrapping the cows in a pale veil that made them look almost like ghosts. They moved slowly, heavy and calm, their dark eyes watchful but unafraid. Sophie rose to her knees, her breath still ragged, and gazed at them. For a moment, awe pushed back her fear. She had crossed the line. She was standing in the place that had always seemed forbidden, unreachable. The land smelled different here, richer, sweeter, alive with the scent of hay and clover. She tightened her grip on the tin can, its dented body cool in her hands. Her knuckles were white, but her eyes had shifted, burning now with something new. Determination. Every sound still struck her like thunder. A crow cawed from a fence post, and her heart leapt into her throat. The snap of a twig beneath her bare foot felt like a gunshot. Even the gentle flap of her own dress in the breeze sounded too loud. She moved with the precision of a hunted creature, crouched low, her breath shallow. But step by step, she pressed forward. Each yard carried her deeper into forbidden territory, closer to the cows whose milk might mean survival. Her mind whispered again, but now the voice was different. Not fear, not warning. It was her own voice, steady and resolute, echoing the truth she had spoken in the darkness. If I don't try, Ethan won't survive. The fence was behind her now. The cows were ahead. And Sophie, trembling but unbroken, kept walking into the mist of dawn. The mist lay low across the Dalton pasture, curling around Sophie's ankles like ghostly fingers as she moved forward. Clutching the tin can so tightly, her hands ached. Her breath came in short bursts, and every few steps she froze, certain the sound of her heartbeat alone would betray her. The grass, wet with dew, clung to her legs, leaving dark streaks on her already stained dress. Ahead, one cow grazed apart from the others, her great body outlined in the rising light. The animal's coat was a patchwork of brown and white, glossy with health, her sides full, her eyes large and liquid. Sophie stopped, her breath catching. To her, the cow looked impossibly big, like a mountain with gentle eyes. For a moment, she could not move. She felt too small, too foolish. What did she know about cows? She had only watched from the other side of the fence, peeking through slats, her heart aching as she imagined the sweetness of milk on Ethan's lips. She had seen the farmhands tug expertly at udders, filling pails with easy rhythm, but her own hands were clumsy, untried. The cow lifted her head then, ears flicking, nostrils flaring at the scent of the intruder. Sophie froze, unable to breathe. The animal's gaze locked on her, steady, unhurried, not unkind. There was no anger in those dark eyes, no threat, only a quiet curiosity, as though the cow had already judged her and found no danger. Sophie swallowed hard, her throat dry despite the damp air. She lowered herself slowly, pressing her palm flat against the grass to steady her trembling. With small, hesitant steps, she crept closer. Her tin can rattled against her chest, and she pressed it tighter, whispering softly, "Please, please don't be afraid. I'm not here to hurt you." The cow blinked slowly, as though in answer. When Sophie was close enough to feel the animal's warmth radiating toward her, she extended her hand. Her fingers shook as she reached forward, stopping just shy of the cow's flank. The animal did not move away. Tentatively, Sophie let her hand rest on the cow's side. The hide was warm and alive beneath her touch, the muscles shifting gently under her palm. A sob nearly broke free of Sophie's chest, not of fear, but of relief. The cow accepted her. She pressed her cheek briefly against the cow's side, closing her eyes. For a moment, it was as though she could hear Ethan's breathing, steady and safe, instead of the desperate gasps he made each night. The tin can clinked softly as she set it down beneath the animal. Her hands fumbled nervously, fingers slipping against the smooth, swollen udder. She had no real practice, only what she had seen in stolen glances. She squeezed once, clumsy and awkward, and nothing came. Her stomach twisted with panic. "Please, please, I can't fail now." She tried again, adjusting her grip, pulling gently the way she remembered. A stream of warm milk burst forth, hitting the bottom of the can with a metallic ping. Sophie's heart lurched. She almost cried out, but clamped her lips shut, her eyes wide. She tried again, and again. Each pull brought another squirt of milk, each drop sounding louder than thunder in the silence. The tin can echoed with every strike, the metallic clinks ringing in her ears. She pressed her lips tightly, trembling as tears slipped down her cheeks. Milk. Real milk. The can slowly filled, white froth bubbling at the edges. The smell rose, warm and sweet, mingling with the sharp tang of metal. Her arms began to ache, but she did not stop. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her forehead damp with sweat. Her entire body shook, not just from effort, but from the weight of what this meant. Every drop was Ethan's survival. Every clink was hope made real. Her mind swirled with images. Ethan's small hands gripping the tin cup, his lips wet with milk, his cries softening into contentment. For the first time in days, she let herself imagine him smiling. The cow shifted slightly, and Sophie's heart jumped, fearing the moment was over. But the animal merely flicked her tail and let out a soft, low moo that seemed almost reassuring. Sophie pressed her face against the cow's flank for a moment, whispering through her tears, "Thank you. Thank you so much." The can was not full. How could it ever be? But to Sophie it seemed like a treasure chest. She lifted it carefully, hands shaking, watching the milk slosh inside. It was heavier than she expected, and she hugged it close to her chest, as though shielding it from the world. Her knees felt weak as she stood. The mist curled around her legs, cool and damp, but inside she felt a fragile warmth spreading. It was as if for a brief moment, the earth itself had conspired to give her mercy. She glanced around the field. The other cows grazed calmly, unbothered, but Sophie felt as if they watched her with quiet approval. She whispered again, to them this time, "I'll never forget this. I'll never forget what you gave us." Her heart still pounded violently, but now it carried something besides fear, determination, a fragile, flickering hope. She bent down, lifted the tin can with both hands, and took her first trembling steps back toward the fence. Behind her, the gentle cow lowered her head, chewing slowly, calm and unbothered, as though she knew she had just saved 2 children she would never meet. And in Sophie's chest, where terror and despair had lived for too long, something new sparked, a fragile flame of courage. The morning light had just begun to sharpen, burning away the mist that draped the fields like a veil. Sophie, clutching the dented tin can brimming with warm milk, felt as if she carried a piece of salvation itself. Her small arms quivered beneath its weight, but she hugged it tight, whispering promises to Ethan in her mind. "Just a little longer, my love. Just a little longer, and you'll drink." She turned, her bare feet sinking into the damp grass, when a sound froze her mid-step, heavy boots striking the earth, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. Sophie's breath caught. She dared a glance toward the farmhouse, and her heart sank like a stone into deep water. Frank Dalton was coming. The man was a figure as hard as the land he ruled. Broad shoulders wrapped in a pressed vest, a gold watch chain glinting against the morning light, his hat casting a shadow over small, merciless eyes. His jaw was set like iron, his lips curled downward, as though life itself had offended him. In one hand, he carried a polished stick of hickory, its weight casual, its threat clear. "Thief," he spat, his voice carrying across the pasture, cutting through the morning like a whip. "Little rat creeping where she doesn't belong." Sophie stumbled back, the tin can nearly slipping from her grasp. She clutched it desperately, the milk sloshing, her eyes wide and wild. "Please, please, sir," she whispered, but her voice barely carried. Dalton closed the distance in long, heavy strides, the grass bowing under his boots. His face reddened, veins swelling in his temples, as if the very sight of the child defiling his pasture was an insult too great to bear. You dare steal from me." His words dripped with venom. He lifted the stick, its shadow stretching long across the ground. "Every drop in that can is mine. Mine. And you think you can just take it?" Sophie's knees buckled. She crouched low, hugging the tin can to her chest, as though she could shield both herself and the precious liquid from his wrath. Tears blurred her vision, but she managed to choke out, "It's for my brother. He's so hungry. Please." "Silence," Dalton thundered, his voice a storm breaking. "Thieves don't get excuses. Thieves get punishment." The stick rose higher. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, a sob tearing from her throat. But before the blow could fall, the ground seemed to shift beneath her. A low, deep sound rumbled through the air, soft at first, then louder, multiplying, until it became a chorus of defiance. The cows were moving. One by one, the animals that had grazed in quiet indifference turned their heads toward the scene, their eyes, calm and dark, fixed not on Sophie but on Dalton. Slowly, deliberately, they began to walk forward, hooves pressing into the wet soil with a rhythm that built like thunder. Dalton paused, his arm still raised. His eyes darted around as the herd advanced, their bodies forming a half-circle around the child. Sophie opened her eyes and gasped. She was surrounded, the warm bulk of the animals pressing close, their breaths heavy, their presence solid as stone. The cow she had milked earlier took the lead, stepping directly between Sophie and the man with the stick, her massive head lowered, nostrils flaring, tail flicking with agitation. She let out a long, deep moo that vibrated in Sophie's chest, a sound that was less call than warning. Dalton barked a bitter laugh, though his voice cracked with unease. "Out of my way, beasts! She's mine to teach!" He swung the stick toward the lead cow, but the animal did not flinch. Instead, she stamped her hoof hard, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. Another cow joined, then another, their bodies closing ranks. The circle tightened until Sophie was pressed within their wall of flesh and bone, safe in a fortress of instinctive mercy. Their large eyes blinked slowly, steady and unafraid, as if daring Dalton to come closer. Dalton's face twisted in disbelief. "This is madness," he growled, spittle flying from his lips. "Dumb animals don't protect thieves." He swung his stick in the air, but even he hesitated to strike. There was something unnatural in their unity, something that made the hairs rise on his neck. Sophie clutched the milk to her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks. She did not understand why, but she felt the animals were shielding her. Their warmth pressed against her back, their musky scent filling her nose, their steady breathing syncing with the wild panic of her own. For the first time since Dalton appeared, she felt a sliver of safety. Dalton bellowed again, his fury mounting. He lunged forward, trying to shove past the herd, but the cows surged as one, cutting him off. One swung her head sharply, horns catching the air dangerously close to his ribs. He stumbled back, cursing, the stick trembling in his grip. "You'll regret this," he snarled, glaring at Sophie as if his hatred could pierce through the living barrier. "You'll regret ever stepping foot on my land." But Sophie was already moving. A gap opened in the circle, small, fleeting, but enough. The cows shifted as if guiding her, their great bodies parting to create a narrow passage. Her legs felt like jelly. Her lungs burned, but she forced herself forward. The tin can sloshed wildly as she clutched it, stumbling into the mist. Behind her, Dalton's shouts rang out, furious and hollow, drowned beneath the deep chorus of mooing. The cows held their ground, blocking his pursuit. Sophie didn't dare look back. She ran, the wet grass cold under her bare feet, her tears hot on her face. The milk spilled in small splashes, leaving a dotted trail across the pasture. But she did not stop. She could not stop. By the time she reached the fence, her body was shaking, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She threw herself to the ground, sliding beneath the lowest wire, her dress tearing anew, barbs scraping her back. Pain seared her skin, but she held the can high, guarding it as though it were her very heart. On the other side, she stumbled to her feet, clutching the dented canister to her chest. The milk inside was only half what it had been, but it was enough. Enough to keep Ethan alive one more day. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, sobbing into the metal. Relief, terror, and gratitude tangled in her chest until she could hardly breathe. Behind her, the chorus of cows still rose, their voices carrying across the fields like a hymn of defiance. Frank Dalton's shouts faded into the distance, powerless against the will of beasts that had chosen mercy over obedience. And Sophie, trembling but alive, staggered back toward the shack. Every step hurt, every breath burned, but she carried hope in her arms. The world blurred around Sophie as she ran, her bare feet pounding the dirt path that cut through the fields. Every step jarred her tiny frame, but she clung to the dented tin can with both arms, as if it were her very soul. The milk sloshed inside, warm against her chest, and with every stumble, a few drops leapt free, trailing behind her like pearls scattered in the dust. Her breath tore at her throat, sharp and ragged. The barbs on her back stung from where the fence had scraped her skin raw, but she paid it no mind. Only one thought pulsed in her head, louder than her heartbeat, fiercer than her fear. Get home to Ethan. Get the milk to Ethan. The landscape flew past her eyes, the weeds that clawed at her legs, the stones that bit into her soles. Pain blurred into the rhythm of her sprint. She staggered once, nearly dropping the can, and a thin stream of white spilled into the dirt. Sophie gasped, horrified, as though she had just spilled her brother's life onto the ground. She pressed the rim tighter against her chest and pushed forward, whispering aloud between sobs, "Hold on, Ethan. I'm coming. Just hold on." The shack came into view, a huddled shadow of rotting wood and crooked beams at the edge of the village. To most, it was nothing but ruin. To Sophie, it was the center of her fragile world. She stumbled up the narrow path, her legs trembling as though they would collapse beneath her. The door was nothing more than planks, hung on rusted hinges. She shoved it open with her shoulder. "Ethan!" she cried, her voice breaking. Inside, the air was heavy, stale with dust, and the faint scent of smoke from a fire long since gone cold. On the dirt floor, curled on a tattered blanket, Ethan stirred at the sound of her voice. His small frame looked even thinner in the morning light that leaked through the cracks in the wall. His cheeks were streaked with dried tears, his lips pale, his eyes half closed from exhaustion. But when he heard her, he lifted his head. His blue eyes, clouded with weariness, but still filled with childlike trust, blinked at her. "Lena," he whispered, using the name only he called her. Sophie dropped to her knees beside him, the tin can trembling in her hands. "I'm here," she said, tears running freely now. "I got it, Ethan." "I got the milk." The boy pushed himself upright on weak arms, his little hands reaching toward the can. Sophie steadied him with one arm while she tilted the tin carefully with the other. She had no cup, no bowl, only her own trembling palms. She dipped her fingers into the milk and held them to his lips. Ethan licked eagerly, his tongue catching the drops, his body quivering with desperate hunger. A soft sound, part sigh, part whimper, escaped him as the taste touched his mouth. His eyes fluttered, and for the first time in days, a flicker of joy broke through his face. Sophie's chest ached at the sight. She poured a little more into her cupped palm, then again, until she dared to tilt the tin and let him drink straight from it. The milk dribbled down his chin, soaking into his collar. But he drank greedily, tiny hands clutching the rim, as if he feared it might vanish. Watching him, Sophie felt the knot inside her unravel. Just a little. Every drop he swallowed was a victory. Every sigh of relief that left his lips was proof she had not failed him. She brushed his damp hair back from his forehead and whispered, "That's it, my love. Drink. You're safe now." When Ethan paused to breathe, he leaned against her chest, still clutching the can as if it were treasure. "It's good," he murmured, voice hoarse but filled with wonder. "It's so good, Lena." Sophie held him tighter, her heart breaking and healing all at once. "I promised, didn't I?" she whispered against his hair. "I told you I'd bring something back." Ethan looked up at her then, milk glistening on his lips, and in that gaze, Sophie saw both the fragility of a child and the unshakable bond that tied them together. He trusted her completely. Even in hunger, even in fear, his faith had never wavered. She pressed her forehead against his, closing her eyes. "I'll keep you safe, Ethan. Always. No matter what it takes." For a while, there was only the sound of his swallowing, the soft clink of milk against the tin, and the quiet rustle of their breathing. Outside, the wind stirred through the brittle grass, rattling the walls of the shack. But within those broken boards, there was a moment of peace. When Ethan finally pulled away, his eyes were half-lidded, heavy with the weight of relief. His belly, though still empty, held enough warmth to soothe him. He curled back into the blanket, his small hand still clutching Sophie's sleeve. Sophie smoothed the hair from his forehead, her tears dripping onto his cheeks and mixing with the milk stains. She wanted to let herself collapse beside him, to rest after the terror of the morning. But she knew the milk wouldn't last. This fragile reprieve would be gone by nightfall, and hunger would return like a wolf scratching at their door. Her gaze lingered on Ethan's face, the softness of his features, the faint curve of a smile tugging at his lips, even in sleep. The world outside was cruel, merciless, but here was the reason she couldn't give in. Here was the reason she would risk everything again. As the first rays of sunlight spilled across the shack floor, Sophie whispered into the silence, a vow carried only by the dust and the wind. "I'll find more. I'll keep you alive. I won't let the world take you from me." And as Ethan's breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep, Sophie held the tin can close to her heart. It was lighter now, nearly empty, but in her mind it was heavy with something far greater than milk. It was heavy with hope. The shack had grown quiet again. Ethan, his belly warmed by the milk, had drifted into a fragile sleep. His small chest rose and fell unevenly, but the desperate, hungry cries that had haunted the night were finally silenced. Sophie sat cross-legged beside him on the dirt floor, her back pressed against the warped wooden wall. The tin can lay beside her, a faint ring of milk clinging to its edges, no more than a mouthful left. She touched the rim with her fingertip, then drew it back as though the metal itself burned. Her eyes lingered on her brother. Ethan's lashes were wet with dried tears, his cheeks streaked with grime, his lips parted in sleep. One tiny hand still clutched the hem of her dress, as though even in dreams he feared she might slip away. Sophie brushed his blonde hair gently from his forehead, her fingers trembling. "I'll keep you safe," she whispered, the words no louder than the sigh of the wind through the cracks in the wall. Her voice trembled, but the vow was fierce, born from something deeper than fear. "No matter what, Ethan. Even if I have to walk back to that farm 100 times. Even if he catches me. I'll keep you safe." Her throat closed around the words. She bowed her head, pressing her lips to his temple, tasting the salt of his skin mixed with the faint sweetness of milk that lingered there. For a long while, she simply held him, letting the warmth of his small body seep into her own chilled frame. But the stillness only made the truth louder. The milk was almost gone. By tomorrow, Ethan would cry again, and she would have nothing to soothe him with. Her arms tightened around him. Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and steady. She tried to smother the sobs in her chest so as not to wake him, biting down on the fabric of her sleeve until it tasted of salt and dust. The memories came, unbidden, the way they always did when she let her guard down. The accident, the flash of fire in the night, the screams that were cut short. The morning after, when she and Ethan were left alone in this world, two small figures standing in the ruins of what had once been home. She could still see her father's tools scattered on the ground, her mother's scarf caught on a broken beam, swaying in the wind like a final goodbye. Since that day, Sophie had not allowed herself to cry where Ethan could see. She had decided, no, forced herself, to become mother, father, sister all at once. Her shoulders were too small, but she carried the weight because there was no one else to bear it. And yet, tonight, as she listened to Ethan's shallow breaths, she let her mask crack. Her tears fell onto his hair, onto the blanket beneath them, until the dirt floor darkened with spots of grief. Her gaze drifted to the hole in the roof where the stars peered down like cold, distant eyes. She whispered to them, too, as if her parents could hear through the sky. "I'm trying. I swear I'm trying. Don't let him hate me when he grows. Don't let him think I wasn't enough." The wind stirred, rattling the broken boards, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint, sweet trace of milk. Sophie wrapped her thin arms around Ethan and rocked him slightly, even though he was already asleep, the way her mother used to do for her. She imagined Ethan older, stronger, no longer hungry. She imagined him laughing, his cheeks round with health, his legs sturdy as he ran through fields not fenced by cruelty, but open, free. In that vision, she saw herself too, not as the trembling child clutching a dented can, but as someone who had kept her promise, someone who had fought and not failed. Her chest ached with longing, but also with the sharp edge of fear. Could she keep it? Could she truly protect him in a world where men like Frank Dalton ruled with iron fists and greedy hearts? She pressed her forehead against Ethan's and whispered again, steadying herself with the words, "I'll keep you safe. Even if I have to give everything, even if I have to lose everything, I'll keep you safe." The moonlight spilled through the broken roof, falling across the boy's sleeping face. In that pale glow, he looked almost angelic. Fragile, yes, but untouched by the cruelty that pressed against their walls. Sophie vowed then that he would remain that way as long as she had breath. Her tears slowed, but the ache in her chest did not. She lay beside him, curling her small frame around his, her arm across his chest, as though her body alone could shield him from the hunger, from the cold, from the world itself. And though her eyes closed, her mind did not rest. It traced again and again the path back to the pasture, to the cows, to the risk that waited there. Fear clawed at her stomach, but hunger would return tomorrow. She had no choice. As sleep finally stole her into a restless dream, her last conscious thought was a vow carved into the marrow of her bones. If I don't try again, Ethan won't survive, and I cannot let him go. I won't. The Dalton mansion sat on the rise above the fields, its white-painted walls catching the last light of dusk like a fortress of pride. From the outside, it looked serene. Lanterns glowing in the windows, polished glass reflecting the soft glow of the horizon. But inside, the house trembled with anger. Frank Dalton paced the length of his study, boots striking the hardwood floor like hammer blows. His broad shoulders were hunched, his fists clenching and unclenching as if the rage inside him demanded some outlet he had not yet found. On the desk lay his hickory stick, abandoned only because his hands shook too violently to hold it steady. "That child," he spat, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet room. "That filthy little thief thought she could make a fool out of me, twice." He slammed his palm down on the desk, rattling the glass of whiskey perched on the edge. The amber liquid sloshed, spilling onto papers that detailed milk yields, grazing schedules, profits, the things that mattered most to Frank Dalton. "She dares sneak onto my land," he growled, pacing again. "Dares lay her hands on what's mine. And the damned animals, my own cows, standing in her defense as if I were the villain. Madness. Utter madness." From the corner, Margaret Dalton sat quietly in an armchair, her hands folded in her lap. The lamplight softened her features, but her eyes were sharp, watchful. She had heard her husband's tirade before, against workers, against neighbors, against anyone who dared question his rule. But tonight, something in his fury unsettled her more than usual. "Frank," she said gently, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "She's only a child." Her words hung in the air, fragile, almost timid. Yet they struck him harder than she intended. He stopped pacing and turned, his small, piercing eyes narrowing in disbelief. "A child?" he repeated, his tone laced with scorn. "A child that steals is no different than a grown thief. Age does not erase crime. You know that." Margaret held his gaze, though her fingers tightened against the fabric of her dress. "But she wasn't stealing to harm you. She was trying to feed her brother. You saw her, Frank, skin and bones, barefoot in your pasture. What else could she do?" Frank snatched the glass of whiskey and downed it in a single swallow, his jaw tightening with every drop. He set the glass down hard enough to crack the rim. "Don't you dare excuse her," he said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "If you give sympathy to one, the rest will follow. Soon the whole village will think they can help themselves to my herd. That's how chaos starts. And I won't allow chaos on my land." Margaret flinched, but did not look away. She thought of the girl's eyes, wide and desperate, brimming with a fear no child should ever know. She thought of the cows pressing in close, their bodies forming a shield, as though they understood something her husband could not. It had shaken her to the core. "Maybe it isn't chaos," she whispered, almost to herself. "Maybe it's justice, or mercy." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Frank froze. His face darkened, red rising from his neck to his temples. He turned slowly, each movement deliberate, controlled, as though holding back an explosion. "Mercy," he said softly, the word curling with disdain. "That is weakness. Weakness destroys men, Margaret. Weakness turns order into ruin. My father taught me that. and his father before him. We built this farm with iron, not sentiment. If I bend once, every beggar and thief will smell blood and tear us apart. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. She looked at the man she had married 15 years ago, the man who had once charmed her with ambition and confidence. Now he stood like a tyrant in his own house, a prisoner of his fear of weakness. She wondered if the cows had sensed it too, not loyalty in him, but cruelty. Her silence seemed to provoke him further. Frank leaned over the desk, his knuckles pressing into the wood. "You don't understand, do you? That girl was nothing but a spark. If I let her walk free, the fire will spread. And when it does, all of this—" He gestured to the ledgers, the land maps, the fine whiskey, the mansion itself. "Everything we've built will turn to ash." Margaret finally rose from her chair, her face pale in the lamplight. "No, Frank," she said quietly, but with a steadiness that surprised even her. "What will turn us to ash is not the hunger of children. It's the hardness in your heart." The words landed heavy in the room. For a moment Frank said nothing, only stared at her, as if she had crossed an invisible line. His mouth twitched as though to argue, but no words came. Instead, he turned away sharply, grabbing the whiskey bottle and refilling his glass with shaking hands. Margaret stood in silence, her own heart pounding. She had never spoken to him like that before. But the image of the little girl trapped in a circle of cows would not leave her. And worse, the fear that her husband could raise his stick against a starving child haunted her even more deeply than his words. As the clock ticked in the corner, Margaret realized something had shifted between them. She no longer saw Frank only as her husband, the provider of wealth and land. She saw the cruelty in him as clearly as the cracks in the plaster walls. And in the quiet recesses of her heart, doubt began to take root. Doubt that perhaps the villagers' whispers were true. Doubt that perhaps her husband's empire was not strength, but tyranny. Frank drained his glass and muttered to himself, too low for her to catch. Margaret turned away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She would not let him see her break. Not tonight. But in the shadows of that grand house, her silence was no longer loyalty. It was the first step toward resistance. The night passed like a restless fever. Sophie woke again and again to Ethan's whimpers in sleep, the small cries he made even while dreaming. Each time she pressed her hand over his back, counting every fragile breath until his body stilled again. Yet the silence that followed was worse, because she knew what awaited when he opened his eyes. Hunger, always hungry. By dawn, Sophie was already upright on the dirt floor, her arms wrapped around her knees. The tin can lay beside her, rinsed of its last drops. Ethan stirred, lips smacking unconsciously, one hand seeking her even in sleep. She smoothed his hair and forced her voice steady. "I'll be back soon, Ethan. I promise." He didn't wake, but his fingers clenched the blanket tighter. Sophie lingered, chest aching, then pried herself away, clutching the dented can like a lifeline. The morning air bit at her skin, the horizon pink, cattle shadows grazing in the distance. Beyond them loomed Frank Dalton's farm, its fences stretching like prison bars, locking away abundance from the starving. Her legs trembled. She remembered Frank's fury, the shadow of his raised stick, and how the cows had shifted, forming a wall of flesh that saved her for one breathless instant. Now she walked back toward it. Fear coiled inside her, but hunger was louder. Ethan's face, pale, lips cracked. ribs pressing through skin, haunted her. If she stayed, he would wither. If she risked everything, they might both live another day. So she walked. At the fence, her hands shook. The barbs had already scarred her, but a shallow scratch was nothing compared to Ethan's emptiness. Closing her eyes, she wriggled through until the ground received her again. The farm opened before her, a sea of pastures, cows moving through mist. She pressed the can to her chest and crossed quickly, eyes darting for any sign of Frank. The cows turned as she neared. A brown and white heifer lifted its head. Sophie whispered, "Please, just for a little. Please help me." The cow lowered its head again. Permission. Sophie pressed her palm against its flank, warmth radiating through her fingers. She knelt, found the udder, and began to squeeze. The first stream of milk struck the tin with a metallic plink. Her heart leapt, then steadied as the rhythm grew. Plink, 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 frothy liquid rising. Her arms ached, but she ignored it. Each drop was life. Each drop was Ethan's tomorrow. The sweet, earthy smell filled her nose. For a moment, she imagined Ethan's eyes lighting up again, his hands clapping when the milk touched his lips. Still, every sound made her flinch. A branch creaked. Grass rustled. She imagined Frank's boots thudding closer. Yet she kept milking, faster, as though her hands could outrun fate. The can grew heavy, nearly 3/4 full. Sophie whispered thanks against the cow's warm side, tears in her eyes. Then the ground shook. Boots, heavy, fast, deliberate. "You again!" The voice cracked across the field. Sophie froze, tin can trembling, milk sloshing dangerously. Through thinning mist loomed Frank Dalton, broad-shouldered, face red with fury, stick clutched in hand. Sophie scrambled back, spilling precious milk. "I warned you," Frank roared. "Stealing once was enough, and now you dare come back? My brother, he's hungry." Sophie's voice cracked. "Silence." He raised the stick. "You think hunger gives you the right to steal from me?" Sophie stumbled, fell, the can clattering, milk bleeding into grass. Her sob escaped. "Please, I'll never come back. Just don't." But Frank's arm was already rising. A low, resonant cut the air. The cow Sophie had milked stepped forward, angling between her and Frank, horns tilted in warning. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, 6 formed a barrier of flesh and muscle, breaths puffing in the cool air. Frank stopped short. "What the?" The cows stamped, eyes locked on him, a living wall. Sophie pressed against them, clutching her can, tears streaking her face. "Move!" Frank swung the stick toward the nearest cow. It didn't flinch. Instead, a hoof stamped. Another bellow followed, joined by a chorus, until the field vibrated with defiance. On the porch, Margaret Dalton appeared, drawn by the noise. She saw the cluster of animals, then the small figure within them, and her breath caught. A child. "Frank," she called. "What are you doing?" He snarled without looking back. "Teaching a lesson this rat won't forget." But Margaret stepped closer, skirts brushing her ankles. The girl's thin frame, dirt-smudged cheeks, and raw terror pierced her. And the cows, standing as guardians. Something shifted in her chest. "She's starving, Frank. Can't you see that? Even the cows do." The words hung in the air. Frank faltered, stuck trembling, eyes darting from the girl to his herd. For the first time, doubt flickered. Margaret stepped through the cattle, who parted to let her pass, and found herself before Sophie. Up close, the child looked smaller, eyes too hollow for her face, tin can trembling. Margaret's throat tightened. "Give me the can, child," she said softly. Sophie searched her face, then surrendered it. Margaret turned to her husband. "Hire her in the kitchen. She can peel potatoes, scrub pots. No pay, just meals. No one needs to know. No one ever knows, until everyone does," Frank snapped. "Children aren't ledgers," Margaret shot back. For a moment, silence. Frank's jaw worked, but then he barked a laugh. "No, not today." He whistled sharply. Antonio, the foreman, appeared. Frank pointed. "Lock her in the Old North barn. 3 days. Water by the hour. Enough bread to remember the taste." Margaret seized his arm. "She's 7. Then she'll learn young." Sophie's breath hitched. "Please, my brother, he's waiting." Margaret pleaded again, but Frank turned away. 3 days. Antonio tipped his hat, apology in his eyes, and moved carefully into the cattle ring. "Easy, girls," he murmured. When he reached Sophie, he knelt. "I'm sorry, Pequeña. Come with me." Sophie whispered. "He's 3. Margaret's fingers dug into the tin can. "Frank, don't make our house a place where mercy cannot breathe." But Frank walked off, swallowed by the porch shadows. The cows rumbled, uneasy. At last they allowed Antonio through. Sophie rose on wobbling knees, took his hand. Margaret drifted closer, pressing the can into Antonio's grip. "For the child," she said, "and his brother." Frank turned to object, but the herd shifted, blocking his view. He said nothing. Antonio led Sophie toward the north barn. The cows followed like an honor guard until the path bent. The barn loomed, grey boards sagging, window a tired eye. At the door, Antonio whispered, "I'll bring water. And bread." "Thank you, Don Antonio," Sophie said. "Just Antonio." He opened the groaning door, guided her inside. Before stepping out, Sophie raised her hand toward the cows, farewell and gratitude in one. The lead cow dipped its head, blessing her. Inside, the air smelled of straw and iron. Antonio set a bucket for her to sit. "I'll return soon." Sophie swallowed. "Can I tell someone where my brother is? He's waiting." Antonio nodded. "We'll see he's watched." She sagged with relief. The door closed, light thinning to a sliver. Silence pooled. In the shack beyond the fence, Ethan woke to a room shaped by his sister's absence. He listened for the sound he trusted most. Bare feet on dirt, a tin can tapping, her voice calling his name. Hours passed. "Lena?" he called, small and hopeful. Only the wind answered. At last, tears left clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. He tucked his hands under his knees, the way Sophie had taught him. "I'll be brave till you come," he whispered. Back in the barn, Sophie pressed her ear to the door, whispering into the seam of light. "I'm coming back, Ethan. Be brave a little longer." Outside, the herd lifted their heads in unison, as if answering. Their lowing rolled out over the fields, a sorrowing hymn that crossed fences, porches, and the thin walls of a shack, reaching the boy who believed a promise could be stronger than a locked door. The door slammed with a groan of timber, the latch scraping into place. Sophie froze, her back pressed to the planks, listening to Antonio's key turn. Then came silence, thick and absolute. The barn was darker than the shack she called home. No cracks of light, no window, only blackness and smell, sour hay, damp wood, old rot. Sophie hugged the dented tin can, its rim still warm from the milk. Her knuckles were raw from gripping it when Frank's men dragged her here. It was all she had left. "Ethan," she whispered. The shadows swallowed her voice. She slid down the wall, knees to chest, can between her arms. A rat skittered across hay, and she stifled a scream. She hated the sound of her own fear. Her parents' deaths rose unbidden. The runaway wagon, the overturned cart, her mother's shawl in the dust, her father's hand slipping from hers. That was when she stopped being a child. The barn's suffocating dark made it vivid again. She forced her breathing to match the sigh of wind through the cracks. "I'll be brave for you, Ethan." She pictured his hand clutching her sleeve the night before, whispering, "Come back quick, Lena." Now he was alone, waiting. The thought broke her. Tears streaked her cheeks, soaking the dust. Then came a low sound, a moo, long and resonant, trembling through the walls. Another answered, then another, until the air hummed with a chorus. Sophie pressed her ear to the door. The cows, the herd. Their voices weren't frantic but insistent, like sentinels on watch. "They didn't leave me," she whispered. For the first time since the lock turned, she felt something besides fear. Exhausted, she curled into a corner of hay, clutching the can like a heartbeat. In sleep, she dreamed of cows forming a wall around her, an unspoken promise she wasn't alone. Outside, the Texas night lay heavy and starless. The fields stretched in shadow until one cow moaned, then another, until the pasture rang with dozens of voices. Their silhouettes gathered near the old barn, hooves drumming a slow, deliberate march. They formed a circle, heads bowed low, calls rolling in waves. From his quarters, Antonio stirred. He knew cattle voices, storms, coyotes, calves separated, but never this. Lantern in hand, he stepped into the night. The herd didn't scatter when he approached. Instead, they shifted deliberately, parting to let him through. A chill crawled his skin. At the front stood a mottled heifer he recognized, the same Sophie had milked. Now her head lifted, eyes fixed on the barn, her bellow deep enough to rattle his lantern. Antonio swallowed. Everyone knew the girl was locked inside for 3 days. He had obeyed, as always. But watching the herd stand guard for her, shame settled heavier than obedience. He raised the lantern. The cows pressed tighter, protective. Through the cracks, he thought he heard it. A whisper, the fragile breath of a child. His chest tightened. Sophie. The herd's chorus grew louder, shaking the barn walls. Antonio stepped back, unsettled. These were not frightened animals. They were protesting, rebelling. "My God," he murmured, crossing himself. He thought of Frank's cruelty, of his own silence, and of the girl clutching a dented can like an anchor. Nature itself seemed to resist now, the herd declaring her not alone. A gust rattled the roof. The cows stamped harder, their lowing rising until Antonio feared the whole house might wake. Margaret, perhaps, already restless. Villagers down the road might hear. He pressed a hand to the door. Cool wood, rough grain. Inside, Sophie whispered her brother's name. Outside, the herd stood like sentinels of justice. Antonio turned away, the question gnawing in him. How much longer could he stand at Frank Dalton's side? Back in the shack, silence weighed heavy. Ethan, barely 3, sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, tugging at a tattered blanket. His blue eyes stared at the door. "Lena?" he called softly. The nickname echoed back. He tried again, louder. "Lena!" His voice cracked. Only the wind answered. He hadn't eaten since Sophie softened their last scrap of bread with water. She had promised to return. He clung to that promise like a breath, but it didn't quiet the gnaw in his belly. He drank from the tin cup, wiping his sleeve across his mouth. The water did nothing. Hunger ached sharper, and tears came. Lena. His voice broke. The shack shrank around him. He remembered his mother's lullabies, his father's strong hands. Both gone in the accident he barely understood. Sophie had become everything: mother, father, protector. Now, even she is gone. He clutched the blanket, rocking. Come back. The silence was unbearable. His cries turned raw, desperate, the only language grief allowed. At every creak, he lifted his head, hoping it was her. But no footsteps came, only wind rattling the walls. Hope collapsed into sobs until exhaustion dulled hunger. Ethan curled tighter, cheek to the dirt, blanket under his chin. Tears dried in streaks. Even in sleep, his lips moved faintly. Lena. The shack returned to silence, broken only by the whimper of a child dreaming of the sister who was his world. Across the fields, Sophie whispered his name through barn walls, and though neither could hear, their bond pulsed strong as a heartbeat. Two children against cruelty, clinging to each other in absence. The patrol truck slowed to silence, its headlights cutting off. Officer Daniel Reed stepped into the chill night, Kaiser leaping down beside him, body tense. The German shepherd pulled hard toward Dalton's barn, growling deep in his chest. Daniel's flashlight swept across the pasture. The sight froze him. Dozens of cows pressed tight around the barn, bodies angled inward, heads lowered, their lowing a chorus that shook the ground. Not restless. Guarding. Kaiser lunged at the barn door, claws raking the wood, barking with an urgency Daniel had never heard. Then came the faintest voice through the cracks, thin, trembling. Help, please. Daniel's chest tightened. Sweetheart, I'm Daniel. I'm a police officer. You're safe now. Inside, a sob. Please, don't leave me. I won't, he promised. The herd roared louder, stamping hooves, eyes flashing in the lantern beam. Even Kaiser seemed to join their protest, barking sharp and defiant. Daniel's hand tightened on his radio. Unit 12, child locked in Dalton barn. Request immediate backup. The words had barely left his lips when heavy footsteps struck the gravel. Frank Dalton stormed forward, lantern swinging. Reed, what the hell are you doing on my land? Daniel didn't move. Kaiser bared his teeth, growling, vibrating like thunder. There's a child inside, Daniel said evenly. Care to explain why? Frank sneered. Thief. Twice she stole from me. She needs to learn. Locking a child in a barn isn't discipline, Daniel snapped. It's cruel, and it's a crime. Open the door. This is my farm. My rules, Frank barked. But his voice cracked as the herd surged tighter, their moods rising like judgment. Daniel stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Frank's light. Look at them, Frank. Even your cattle know what you've done is wrong. For a moment, Frank faltered, eyes flicking toward the glowing ring of eyes, the growling dog, the officer who would not bend. Sophie whimpered again inside, a small sound that cut the night open. Frank's jaw worked. At last, his voice broke rough. Fine. You want her? She's yours, but don't expect me to feed every stray. Daniel's reply was steel. She isn't a stray. She's a child. And tonight, you showed the world who you really are. Kaiser barked once, final and sharp. The cows stamped and bellowed, the living wall refusing to yield. And in that moment, Frank Dalton, for all his power, stood exposed, trembling in the face of law, loyalty, and the unyielding judgment of his own herd. The lock groaned under Daniel Reed's grip, metal grinding against metal as he forced the rusted latch. Kaiser pressed close, barking with a fury that shook the wooden barn walls. The cows shuffled, stamping their hooves, their anxious lowing rising into the cold night air. With one last wrench, the padlock snapped. The heavy door screeched open, releasing a stale breath of rot, hay, and damp wood. Daniel lifted his lantern, its glow barely piercing the gloom. For a heartbeat, nothing but shadows. Then, in the far corner, a small figure stirred. Sophie. His voice was soft, steady, urgent. The child raised her head. Her eyes, enormous and wet with exhaustion, caught the lantern light like shards of glass. For a moment she stayed frozen, unable to believe someone had come. Then her frail body lurched forward. Before Daniel could move, Kaiser surged inside. The German shepherd lowered his head, sniffing gently, his growl replaced by a soft whine. Sophie stared at the massive dog, lips parted, breath shallow. Then she collapsed into him, arms wrapping his thick neck, her sobs breaking free for the first time in days. "Thank you," she whispered into his fur, clinging to him as though the world outside no longer mattered. Kaiser leaned into her embrace, tail thumping once against the dirt. His warm breath washed her cheek, a quiet huff of reassurance. Daniel swallowed hard. He had seen children cry before, but never gratitude this raw, spoken to a dog before a man. He knelt beside them. "You're safe now, Sophie. Kaiser and I are here. No one will hurt you again." She glanced at him briefly, but pressed her face back into Kaiser's coat, as if only the dog could carry her relief. Daniel laid a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right. Hold on to him as long as you need. He's yours tonight." The barn was damp and hostile, rats in the rafters, mildew clinging to hay. But in that corner, with a child gripping a dog like salvation, it became almost holy. Her sobs eased into hiccups. Between breaths, she whispered, "I was so scared, so dark. I thought Ethan would be alone forever." "You'll see him soon," Daniel promised. "He's waiting for you." Kaiser gave a low whine, as if echoing the vow. Sophie stroked his muzzle with trembling reverence. "You saved me," she whispered. Daniel didn't correct her. Perhaps she was right. Finally, he reached for her. "Come on, Sophie. Let's get you out." She hesitated, reluctant to let go. Only when Kaiser nudged her gently did she allow Daniel to lift her. She was feather light, far too light for a child of 7. Her small hand stayed tangled in Kaiser's fur until the last possible moment. Outside, the night air was sharp. Daniel carried her across the yard, Kaiser pacing at his side, every step measured. Sophie whispered into his shoulder, "Don't leave him behind." Daniel's reply was firm. "I wouldn't dream of it." The cows breathed heavily around them, the lantern casting arcs of light on weathered barn walls. Then hurried footsteps broke the silence. Margaret Dalton appeared from the house, her nightrobe billowing in the wind, hair disheveled. The lantern caught her pale face. Her eyes widened at the sight of Sophie in Daniel's arms. "Oh, dear God." Her hand flew to her mouth. She stumbled forward and fell to her knees in the dirt. "My child, what have we done?" Sophie stirred at the sound. At first she recoiled, recognizing the wife of the man who had locked her away. But then she saw something different in Margaret's face. Anguish, raw and unguarded. Margaret leaned closer, her tears falling freely. I should have protected you. I saw you begging him, and I did nothing. Fear silenced me when compassion should have guided me. Her voice cracked, dissolving into sobs. Daniel tightened his jaw. The woman he remembered as quiet and refined was now stripped bare, trembling, broken. Sophie blinked, too weak for words, but her eyes stayed fixed on Margaret's face. Something unspoken passed between them. Margaret crawled forward, hands folded like a supplicant. Forgive me, Sophie. I should have been your voice when you had none. I should have been your shield. Instead, I looked away. The night still stood. Even the cows seemed to listen. Kaiser shifted, huffing softly. Not a warning, but recognition. Daniel adjusted Sophie so she could face Margaret fully. Her lips trembled. Slowly, she reached out one small, grimy hand and touched the woman's cheek. Margaret clasped it against her face and broke completely. You never should have been the one to suffer, she sobbed. I am so sorry. It was unbearable in its tenderness. A woman undone by guilt, a child extending silent compassion. Sophie did not pull away. For her, forgiveness came in the simplest gesture, letting her hand remain. Margaret pressed a kiss to Sophie's dirt-streaked hand. You deserved kindness. I will spend the rest of my days trying to give it to you. Daniel finally spoke. If you mean what you say, Mrs. Dalton, then stand with her now. Stand against him. Margaret lifted her tear-streaked face. Grief hardened into resolve. I will. For her. For Ethan. She rose, robe streaked, hair wild, but posture straighter than it had been in years. Daniel shifted Sophie again, but before leaving, looked at her. Then tonight begins a reckoning. Margaret nodded. Never again will you be left unprotected, she whispered. The vow still hung in the air when another sound broke across the farm. Small feet pounding the dirt, a woman's voice calling out. Daniel swung his lantern. Doña Socorro, the elderly neighbor, stumbled forward, her shawl trailing, steadying the child who fought to run ahead. It was Ethan. His small frame darted forward, bare feet bleeding, hair tangled, tears streaking his cheeks. Lena! Lena! His cry cut through the night. Sophie stirred. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then she heard it again, his voice. She twisted in Daniel's arms, eyes brimming. Ethan. Doña Socorro reached them, panting. He heard the cows. He knew his sister was here. No one could hold him back. But Ethan tore free and sprinted across the yard, arms outstretched. Daniel crouched and set Sophie down. Her legs trembled, but she steadied. She lifted her arms just as Ethan collided into her. The reunion was desperate, tangled, messy. Ethan buried his face in her chest, sobbing. You came back. Sophie kissed his hair again and again. I promised. I'll never leave you. Margaret pressed a hand to her heart, overcome by the sight. Kaiser padded forward, pressing his head against the children's sides, sealing their embrace. Ethan looked up through tears. You saved her, he whispered to the dog. Kaiser huffed softly. Sophie stroked his fur. He saved me, Ethan. And now we're together. Doña Socorro wiped her eyes. Children who have nothing, yet hold each other like they hold the world. How could anyone call her a thief when all she stole was hope for her brother? Daniel's jaw flexed, silent but resolute. Ethan brushed dirt from Sophie's cheek. They said you were gone. I thought I'd never see you again. As long as I'm breathing, "You'll never be alone," she whispered. The cows mooed again, softer now, almost like a lullaby. Margaret rose shakily, whispering to Ethan, "You are braver than most men I've known." Ethan clung tighter to Sophie, wary but comforted by her whisper. "It's all right. She's trying to help." Doña Socorro laid a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Niña, you don't have to carry this burden alone. Tonight, people have seen. The truth is no longer hidden." Sophie swayed with exhaustion, but the strength of her brother's arms gave her resilience. She was no longer just the girl locked away in darkness. She was a sister, reunited, protector renewed. Ethan pressed his face into her chest, whispering, "I knew you'd come back." And Sophie, for the first time in days, allowed herself a trembling smile. Always. The lantern light flickered over them. 2 children, bound by love, a dog guarding their side, neighbors bearing witness. The Dalton farm, once a place of fear, had become the setting of something else entirely. A reunion so raw and pure, even the stars above seemed to hold their breath. The Dalton farm had long been a place of uneasy silence. Fences too tall, gates too heavy, a master too absolute. But tonight, silence broke. It began with the cows. Their lowing rolled across the fields for hours, restless, unrelenting. Not fear, but insistence. A bell tolling at the wrong hour. In bed, neighbors turned and muttered. Then, as the chorus swelled into something strange and purposeful, they rose. Lanterns flickered to life. Doors opened. Families stepped out in shawls against the chill. Children clutched their hands and asked what the animals were saying. Men traded looks that carried old knowledge and older reluctance. Everyone knew Frank Dalton fattened his cattle while children in shacks went hungry. Everyone knew no creature, man or beast, dared raise a voice against him. Until tonight, 2 hands from the next ranch reached the iron gate first, boots thick with mud, a lantern swinging between them. The moose crested and fell like a tide. The sound centered near the north barn. Not coyotes, not a storm. Something human in its urgency. "What in God's name are they on about?" one muttered. "Not coyotes," the other said, eyes following a steadier glow deeper in the yard. Daniel Reed's lantern. "Something's happening in there." Within the hour, the road filled. Old men leaned on canes, mothers with babies on hips, teenagers whispering with wide, dark eyes. The crowd pressed to the bars. They didn't surge. They witnessed. Beyond the gate, the herd's chorus answered their murmurs, a call and response that tightened the air until it thrummed. Whispers spread, passed mouth to mouth like smoldering coals. Dalton locked a child in the barn. She stole milk for her brother. God have mercy. A child. The iron rattled with the weight of bodies, not to break it, just to get close enough to see what in their bones they already knew. Something unjust was happening on ground they had feared too long. At the edge stood Doña Socorro, shawl tight, her weathered face carved with fury and sorrow. She had chased Ethan on his desperate run. She had seen enough. "I saw her," she said, loud enough to carry to those nearest, and then farther still. A child no older than 7, locked like an animal, and her little brother, wandering the village crying for her. Tell me, what man calls himself master when he cages a child for mercy? The words sped outward, and rage quickened. Shame on him. Cruelty has no place here. He thinks his wealth makes him untouchable. Lanterns lifted, painting faces that had weathered years under Dalton's shadow. Tonight, emboldened by the cow's defiance and a truth finally spoken aloud, fear gave way to flame. In the yard, Daniel heard them coming, their voices now louder than the herd's lament. He glanced toward the gate and saw a constellation of lanterns bob along the road. He hadn't summoned them. They came because conscience did. Sophie clung to Ethan beside him, face buried in his hair, too weak to grasp the weight beyond the fence, yet alive to the shifting air. It was no longer just her fight. Margaret stood nearby, robe streaked with dust, eyes raw from crying. She looked toward the gate and, for once, felt no urge to hide what lay on this land. Let them see. Let it be known. Frank Dalton stepped onto the porch, lantern in hand, face a thundercloud. He saw the massed neighbors, heard the voices turning against him, and his jaw clamped so hard, a vein jumped in his neck. For years, he had ruled by silence, his and everyone else's. Tonight, cows moaned, a dog barked, and his own neighbors whispered his name like an accusation. The foundation cracked. Let the child out. Show your face, Dalton. God sees what you've done. The gate groaned under the press of bodies and held. The words didn't need entry. They lanced the dark. Frank's lantern shook. For the first time in years, he felt a weight he couldn't lift. A community not bowing but rising. His eyes darted. The barn with its open mouth, the officer at watch, the German shepherd planted between him and the children, muscles tight at the throat. The shadows he'd once claimed now threw him back. Then the road parted. She came slowly, each step deliberate, leaning on a carved wooden cane. The villagers edged aside, the way people make room for a procession. Softly, her name threaded the air. Margarita Santos. For 40 years she had taught Willow Creek, a steel-spined guardian behind a schoolhouse desk, a shield for the small and the overlooked. She was retired now. Shawl faded and frayed, back slightly bent, but her presence still drew attention like iron to a lodestone. Lantern light found the unblinking calm in her eyes. Even the cows seemed to hush as she reached the gate. Authority of a different kind had arrived, not land or money or force, but moral weight. Frank's stride faltered when he saw her. He knew her, as all did. He remembered the ruler across his knuckles when he lied as a boy, and the way she'd called him to account even with his father looming. He'd never learned how to cow her. "Margarita," he muttered, the name sounding like a curse. Her cane clicked against the iron. She lifted her chin, and her gaze walked the yard. Villagers wound tight with outrage. The ring of cows by the barn, the officer with the dog, and the small pale girl clinging to her brother. Margarita's chest tightened. She had seen too many hungry children. This was different. Cruelty chosen, dressed as order. "Frank Dalton," she said. The hush deepened. All ears turned. "You live on land fat with wealth. You sleep in a house too high for any man's need. And tonight, a child no more than 7 has been locked in your barn like an animal. Tell me, what kind of man does this?" A ripple moved through the crowd. Frank's face darkened. He puffed himself larger, lantern high, voice thunder rough. "None of your concern, Margarita. The girl trespassed. She was stealing. She needs to learn." "Stealing?" The cane struck dirt, as sharp as a shot. "Is that what you call a starving child, taking a drop of milk to keep her brother breathing? That is not theft. That is survival. That is love." The blow landed. A mother in the crowd gasped and clutched her son. An old farmer blinked wetness away. Even the herd rumbled, approving, a chorus underscoring the rebuke. "I taught you once," Margarita went on. "Compassion isn't weakness. Strength is measured not by how much you hold, but how much you give. Did you forget every lesson, or bury them under greed? Murmurs rose, sharper, truer. She's right. Children shouldn't suffer. God forgive him. What's he become? Frank raised the lantern higher, face twisted with anger. If I let her get away with this, others will come. There'll be a line at these fences draining me dry. This is my land, my cattle, my work. No one takes from me. No, Margarita said, eyes bright, voice steady. The earth was never yours. You own paper, not breath. Land and life belong to God. And tonight, even your cows know it better than you. The herd bellowed. Sophie, clutching Ethan, watched the old woman with something like awe, the first adult in days who didn't threaten her, but stood for her. On the steps, Margaret trembled. Shame and relief warred on her face, as truths long swallowed poured out in someone else's voice. Margarita's tone softened and became more dangerous. We all see that child, Frank, and hear this. No fence is high enough to hide cruelty now. Call it discipline, call it law. Truth stands here. A little girl punished for loving her brother. And you call yourself a man? Silence tightened to the point of breaking. Outrage orbited close to action. Sweat beaded Frank's temple, despite the chill. Daniel stepped forward, one hand on Kaiser's collar. You heard her, Dalton, he said, voice low and final. This ends tonight. But it was Margarita who held the night. She leaned heavier on her cane, breath labored but spirit unbowed. Hide behind walls, behind wealth. You can't hide from the truth. Not anymore. Tonight you answer to this child, to this village, and to the God who gave you breath. Choose wisely. The crowd erupted. Not chaos, but a single voice braided from many throats, lanterns high, fear washed out by courage. Frank, long master of this valley, felt the ground shift under him. The noise swelled until Margarita raised her cane and stilled it with a glance. She took one more step and fixed Frank with the same gaze that had once pinned him to a desk. Tell me, she said, quiet and clear, and the quiet cut deeper than any shout. Why imprison a child trying to feed her brother? The question fell like a stone into a well. The ripples went out and out until every lantern, every chest, every held breath was a circle on dark water. Frank's jaw flexed. He tried to summon his standard scowl, the one that closed mouths and bent backs. Because, he said, hoarse, because rules matter. Because discipline. Discipline? The cane cracked against dirt. The word shattered. You starve a child for loving her brother, and call that discipline. No, Frank, that isn't law. That's cruelty. Agreement surged. She's right. A child doesn't deserve this. He's lost his soul. Frank's eyes flicked wildly, searching for an ally. He found Margaret instead, tears on her face, her gaze not pleading but judging. She didn't step to his side. She stood with the truth. The lantern trembled in his hand. You don't understand, he muttered, but now it sounded like pleading. We understand hunger, Margarita said, cane digging into the soil. We understand love. We understand burying parents and still keeping little brothers alive. The question isn't whether we understand. It's whether you do. Do you remember what it means to be human? The words struck harder than fists. The armor of arrogance he'd polished for decades began to crack. His lips pressed together and shook. His chest swelled, not with pride, but with something close to grief. From behind him, a small voice threaded the hush. Sophie's, fragile but piercing. She held Ethan's hand. "I just wanted him not to be hungry." The sentence went through the crowd like a blade, clean and final. Eyes turned from the girl to the man with fields fat with cattle. The man who locked milk behind a gate. The weight of that truth bore down heavier than any chain. Frank's lantern slipped. He caught it before it shattered. He stared at the child, small, pale, hurt, and standing. The herd moaned again. Judgment carried on breath. The villagers leaned in. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Margarita's voice gentled to the softness that kills excuses. "Why, Frank? Why cage a child when you could have spared a cup? What did her suffering buy you? Power? Respect? No. Only shame. Tonight, the whole town sees it." He staggered a step. His mouth opened and closed. No argument arrived. The mask split wider, and in the lamplight his eyes shone. Not rage, but something brittle. Regret. Fear. The memory of a boy who once sat in Margarita's class, wanting dignity, more than dominance. For the first time in decades, Frank Dalton lowered his eyes, and the village saw their tyrant plainly, not a master of land and cattle, but a man unraveling under the simplest truth of all. Why harm a child for love? The murmurs rose again, not fear now, but resolve. A crack, once seen, cannot be unseen. Frank raised his face, jaw trembling, pride bleeding into dust. He said nothing. The silence was an admission. At the gate, lanterns steadied. In the yard, Kaiser's growl dimmed to a vigilant hum. Daniel kept his hand at the dog's collar, and his eyes on Frank. Socorro tightened her shawl, gaze fierce and wet. Margaret's hand lifted once, as if to reach for the girl, then fell to her side. No more hiding. Sophie clung to Ethan, and he clung back, tiny fingers laced with the steadiness of those who had decided to stand. The cows answered one last time, low and unified, a verdict carried on breath and frost. The old order of the Dalton farm, built on fear and silence, had been broken by a child's need, a village's witness, and the clear voice of an old teacher. And though the gate still stood and the porch still rose, everyone present understood. From this night on, neither would mean what they used to. The night's fury had begun to quiet. The villagers' shouts fell into murmurs. The cows settled into a low, steady hum, as if content their warning had been heard. Lanterns still glowed around the Dalton farm, catching on tear-streaked faces, clenched jaws, and on Sophie's frail frame as she clung to Ethan. Daniel stayed close, one hand resting on Kaiser's collar. The German shepherd stood tall, eyes locked on Frank Dalton like a sentinel. But when he finally turned, it was not toward the master of the farm. It was toward the children. Ethan pressed into Sophie's side, fists tangled in her ragged dress. His body shook with hiccuping sobs too large for someone so small. When he finally lifted his swollen eyes, Kaiser moved forward slowly, lowering his head, and pressed his nose gently against the boy's hand. Ethan startled, then curled his fingers into the dog's fur. Kaiser exhaled a steady breath, as if telling him without words, "You're safe now." For a moment, Ethan only stared. Then, unexpected, fragile, a giggle slipped out. It was thin, like a cracked bell, but it grew, bubbling up until his small shoulders shook with laughter. He buried his face in Kaiser's coat, clinging tight. The crowd seemed to exhale as one. Mothers wiped their eyes. Men blinked hard. Margaret lifted trembling hands to her mouth. And Sophie let out a broken laugh of her own. See? Even Kaiser knew you needed a friend. Kaiser wagged his tail, nudged Ethan again until the boy's laughter rang brighter, piercing the heaviness that had gripped the farm. Daniel's chest tightened. He had seen too many children broken by hunger and fear, but this laughter reminded him why he carried on. He whispered, "Good boy," brushing Kaiser's flank. Ethan threw his arms around the dog's neck. "You're my best dog." The simple words hung in the air like a prayer. Sophie kissed her brother's forehead, whispering, "And he'll always be ours." Even Dona Socorro murmured from the fence, voice breaking. The boy laughs again. Margaret felt something shift inside her. Guilt would never vanish, but the sound of that laughter planted resolve. If a starving child could laugh again through the nudge of a dog, perhaps she too could change. Kaiser licked Ethan's cheek, drawing another squeal. The boy leaned back against Sophie, and for the first time in days, his face shone not with fear, but joy. The villagers' murmurs softened into something new. Hope. Margarita's words had proven true. Cruelty could not feed the soul, but love, even from an animal, could heal it. Daniel crouched beside them, hand on Sophie's shoulder. "He'll protect you both. Always. Just like tonight." Sophie nodded fiercely. Ethan yawned, exhaustion tugging, but his fingers stayed tangled in Kaiser's fur. The dog stood steady, patient and guardian. The yard grew still. Sophie and Ethan clung together, Kaiser watching over them, while the villagers pressed to the gate, their faces no longer only angry but convicted. And on his porch, Frank Dalton remained, rigid, pale, the lantern shaking in his hand. The master of the largest dairy farm in the county now looked strangely small. Margarita Santos, steady on her cane, did not look away. Her words still lingered. Why imprison a child for loving her brother? Daniel's voice carried. "You've heard her question, Dalton. So has everyone here. Answer it, right now." Frank's chest heaved. His lips parted, but silence pressed heavier than speech. At last he stammered, I had to. She stole. If I let one child take it, then every family would—" "What?" Margarita's cane struck the dirt, sharp as a gavel. "Would you eat? Would I live? Do you hear yourself?" The villagers answered with their own chorus. "Children don't deserve this." "Shame on him." Frank's lantern handle shook in his fist. His voice rose, desperate, drained of its old power. "You don't understand. If I showed softness, they'd think I was weak. They'd take everything I've built. I couldn't—" He stopped, breath ragged. The iron mask slipped. What showed beneath was not rage, but fear. Not of Sophie, not of theft, but of weakness. Daniel's voice cut through, quiet, but sharp. "So you locked a child in a barn to protect your pride. Not cattle, not land, just pride." Frank's jaw trembled. He looked at Margaret. She did not move to his side. Her silence judged him more than words. The cows moaned, low and mournful, as if delivering their own verdict. Sophie's whisper carried faintly, I only wanted to help Ethan. Something inside Frank broke. The lantern slipped from his hand, thudding into the dirt. His shoulders sagged, his hands opened, trembling. I was afraid, he rasped. Afraid that if I gave even a little, I'd lose everything. My father taught me that softness was a disease, that men ruled with iron or didn't rule at all. I believed him, and it poisoned me. His eyes lifted, wet with tears he hadn't shed in decades. I thought cruelty kept me strong, but it made me a coward who hurt a child. The villagers stood stunned. The man they had feared wept openly before them. Margaret stepped forward, tears falling. She reached for his hand. He drew back, ashamed. His gaze flicked toward Sophie and Ethan clinging together. His lips trembled. I don't deserve forgiveness. Margarita's voice steadied, softer now. You cannot undo what's been done, but you can choose what comes after. Tonight you stand stripped of power and pride. What will you do with what remains? Frank's sobs broke loose. Shoulders heaved, pride shattered. The tyrant of the valley crumbled, not by fists, but by a child's hunger and a sister's love. The silence after was heavy, but no longer fearful. Margaret, Rosa, as the village called her, stepped forward, her voice trembling. I know I failed you both, but perhaps there is a way to start again. She turned to Sophie and Ethan. I want to offer you a home, safe, warm, not as servants, but as children who deserve love. Sophie blinked, clutching Ethan tighter. Her lips parted, no words at first. Ethan's small hand squeezed hers. Antonio, standing beside Rosa, spoke firmly. We'll feed you, clothe you, give you a chance to learn. You won't be alone, and most importantly, his eyes flicked to Kaiser. You'll have someone to protect you. Always. Daniel stepped closer, voice carrying authority but gentleness. The law will ensure it. You'll be safe. Those who wronged you will answer. But this isn't just about punishment. It's about healing. For Sophie and Ethan, for all of us. Frank looked at Rosa, at the children, at the neighbors. He saw what fear had never built. Community. Sophie finally whispered, fragile but firm. You would let us stay. Rosa knelt, taking her hand. Yes, querida. You will not be alone again. Not as long as we breathe. Ethan's eyes widened. Really? Daniel bent to meet his gaze. Really? This is your chance to live free from fear. And this community will protect you. The villagers murmured, approval spreading. Safe at last. Justice. It's about time. Kaiser barked softly, tail wagging, as if sealing the promise. Sophie buried her face in his fur. Ethan crouched beside her, patting his back. Rosa looked at Frank. Her voice was gentle, but unyielding. You cannot undo the past, but you can support the future. This is your chance to change. Frank whispered, broken. I don't know how. Antonio laid a firm hand on his shoulder. Then learn. Start by doing right. Daniel took in the scene. The children alive, the village united, the tyrant broken. It was fragile, but real. A beginning. Sophie looked at Rosa, eyes glistening. We will try. Ethan nodded, gripping Sophie's hand and Kaiser's fur. Yes, please, let us stay. Daniel exhaled, shoulders easing. Then it's decided. Tonight marks not just justice, but the chance to rebuild. And so the children stepped forward, guided by Rosa and Antonio, Kaiser pacing faithfully at their side. Behind them, the villagers watched in solemn agreement, a community ready to mend. Even Frank, trembling, understood. The path forward would no longer be ruled by fear, but by choice, and perhaps by redemption. The morning sun spilled across the Dalton farm, painting the fields in gold. Once a place haunted by fear, it now brimmed with laughter and life. The barn that had echoed with Sophie's cries months before stood open, its doors wide to welcome light and birdsong. Around it, new cottages rose in soft pastels, smoke curling from chimneys as families began fresh chapters. Children's laughter carried across grassy knolls, chasing away shadows of the past. They ran barefoot, voices mingling with the hum of bees and the lowing of cows. Gardens overflowed with basil, marigolds, and tomatoes. Villages, once divided by silence, now worked side by side. The Daltons walked openly among them, guilt replaced by purpose. Sophie, now 8, moved with a new confidence. Her chestnut hair caught the sun as she planted marigolds along the paths, Kaiser's watchful eyes always on her. The shepherd nudged her forward, guardian and friend. Nearby, Ethan toddled with a wooden toy car, giggling as he chased butterflies, cheeks full and rosy, hunger a distant memory. He mirrored Sophie's every move, tethered by trust. Rosa Dalton carried baskets of vegetables, her pride shining quietly as she watched her granddaughter laugh freely. Margaret, too, softened by forgiveness, looked on with eyes damp but joyful. Antonio walked with Daniel, who had once come only to enforce the law. Now he repaired fences, organized resources, and marveled at the bond between children and dog. The trust rebuilt from ruin. The farm itself seemed to breathe. Chickens scratched the earth. Cows grazed calmly. Paths were lined with smooth stones. Handmade banners fluttered in the breeze. Hope, friendship, community. Sophie guided Ethan toward the sunflowers she'd planted with Rosa. Ethan's fingers brushed the petals, his giggles joining birdsong. Kaiser followed close, ever the sentinel. Villagers bustled, women with baskets of bread, men repairing pens, children learning to plant. Each act reclaimed life from silence. Rosa brushed Sophie's hair back. "You've grown so brave," she whispered. Sophie leaned into her, eyes bright. "I'm not scared anymore." Ethan wrapped both sister and dog in a hug. "We're happy," he declared. Daniel, watching, felt a quiet relief. Justice mattered, but what mattered more was healing. The children had reclaimed joy, their safety guarded not only by people, but by the unwavering loyalty of a dog. By afternoon, the farm glowed with warmth. Sophie ran barefoot across the yard, Kaiser playful at her side, their bond expressed in laughter and wagging tails. Ethan stumbled after her, clutching his toy car, until Sophie scooped him into her arms. His laughter spilled across the fields like sunlight. Margaret, once heavy with guilt, now walked unaided to kneel among the children. She tied shoelaces, brushed hair, whispered words of pride. Sophie, planting marigolds, squeezed her hand in silent thanks. Nearby, Antonio hammered beams for the new school, children painting bricks with bright colors. "Soon," he told Daniel, "they'll have a place to learn, to dream. This farm is becoming more than a home. It's a sanctuary." Even Frank, once feared, now moved shyly among the villagers. Children tugged at his hands, calling him Grandpa Frank. When Sophie hugged him tightly, chattering about her flowers, his face softened into a smile unseen for decades. "Thank you, Sophie," he whispered. Kaiser, watchful, allowed it. As the sun dipped lower, Sophie and Kaiser chased each other through the fields, her laughter a symbol of healing. Margaret sat on a bench, tears shining openly as she watched. For the first time, she felt peace deeper than relief. Motherhood reborn not through blood, but through care, protection, and forgiveness. Daniel observed the schoolyard where Antonio guided children with patient hands. Even Frank joined in, offering awkward but sincere help. Sophie steadied a boy painting bricks, Kaiser lying at her feet, head resting on her lap. She whispered to him, "Thank you for never leaving me." Ethan, playing tag with other children, glanced often at his sister, his smile wide, reassured by her presence. By evening, families gathered near the central garden, sharing bread and cheese. The air was filled with chatter and music of daily life. Frank, seated beside Margaret, helped Sophie cut a slice of cake, his smile tentative but real. Laughter wove through the crowd. Where once fear had ruled, now connection and redemption thrived. The setting sun turned the fields to firelight. Sophie held Ethan's hand, Kaiser at her side, and looked around at the farm that had once been shadowed. Now it was alive, transformed by compassion, loyalty, and love. Night folded gently over the land. Stars scattered across the sky, silver light washing the cottages and pastures. Peace now lived here, earned through courage and compassion. In the pasture, Sophie perched carefully atop a cow, Ethan beside her on another. Their small hands clutched fur, their laughter rising into the night. Kaiser trotted alongside, alert, yet calm. The cows moved gently, as if they too understood the fragile triumph of this moment. Sophie whispered, "Thank you," to her cow, Ethan echoing the words. It was gratitude, simple and profound. At the pasture's edge, Rosa and Margaret stood hand in hand, tears glistening as they watched the children ride beneath the stars. Antonio leaned against the school fence, smiling softly. The air was alive with quiet music, rustling leaves, frogs by the pond, the steady breath of cows, Kaiser's gentle panting. Sophie brushed Ethan's forehead and whispered, "I'm glad you're here." He answered only with a smile, his hand in hers. Kaiser rested his head on Sophie's leg, loyalty beating steady beneath her touch. Frank stood beside Daniel, his hardened past softened by the sight. Redemption, he realized, was possible even for him. Daniel breathed the night air, wildflowers mingling with earth. Watching Sophie and Ethan ride with Kaiser beside them, he understood. Humanity awakens through innocence, loyalty, and the courage of a few. Sophie whispered to Kaiser, "We'll always take care of each other." Ethan echoed softly, "Always." And in that moment, the farm itself seemed to pause, acknowledging the promise. The cows were no longer just livestock. They were symbols of trust, of harmony born from survival. Under the stars, the Dalton farm was reborn, not by punishment or fear, but by compassion and the quiet heroism of a dog who had never left their side. Daniel's voice, soft in the night, carried across the fields. Sometimes it takes the innocence of children, the loyalty of animals, and the courage of a few to awaken humanity in us all. And so, under a canopy of stars, Sophie and Ethan laughed, Kaiser trotting faithfully beside them, the cows stepping with patient grace. It was a living testament that even in a world scarred by cruelty, compassion could endure, if people chose it. The Dalton farm rested in peace at last, a sanctuary of loyalty, forgiveness, and the unyielding power of love. As we close this story, it's impossible not to feel the quiet, unwavering power of connection, the kind that exists between a child and a loyal dog, between trust and courage, and between hearts willing to care. German Shepherds, like Kaiser, remind us that loyalty isn't just a trait. It's a way of being, a promise to stand by those we love through fear, uncertainty, and darkness. And in their eyes, we see the reflection of our own compassion, a reminder that the bond between humans and animals carries lessons we carry for a lifetime. If your own dog has ever nudged you with understanding, sat patiently by your side during a difficult moment, or simply greeted you with joy after a long day, you know this truth in your heart. And if you'd like to deepen that connection, there are gentle ways to explore it. Resources that guide you to listen, understand, and communicate with your dog on a level that goes beyond commands or treats. One place I've found particularly meaningful is, insert link here, a space that honors the wisdom, patience, and emotional intelligence of our canine companions. Sometimes the smallest steps, quiet walks, shared moments, soft words, can open a whole new world of understanding. Give yourself and your dog that gift.